Welcome to SSI Meetup. Today we will be talking about the $1 trillion business opportunity. And that one, as you know, is called SSI, Self-Sovereign Identity. And we have a very different setup to what we usually have today. We will have Drummond and Vaughan and Chris sharing the presentation in a more detailed, more expanded way as they did it 2 months ago in the Seattle Devcon. And each of them will be sharing with us the key things we need to know about this $1 trillion business opportunity. And yeah, let us quickly review in the next slide what SSI Meetup is about so you can learn about it. Basically, what we're trying to do here is to empower global SSI communities. And this is open to everyone, so it doesn't matter if you're someone around the world who's really interested, you will be able to use this content if you're from a company or an association, because the basic idea is that anything we produce at SSI Meetup can be reused in a very free way, an open source way by everyone. For that, we have a Creative Commons by share alike license, which basically means that you will be able to reuse this material. We will publish it in a Google slide set, and we will publish it in SlideShare. We will also publish the video, and you will be able to download those things and reuse them. The only thing you have to do is to give credit back to the authors, which today will be our 3 guests, and to SSI Meetup. And you can also go back through the whole material we did in the last 18 months. We have like 34 shows. This is show number 34, and you will be able to use all that material too. If you have any questions during the webinar, please just use the questions tool. During the webinar, you will have different opportunities. First, Chris will be talking, then we will have Vaughan, and then we will have Drummond. And you will also be able to share your questions at the end of the whole webinar. So Drummond will make a quick round of introductions and share with us the 2 other guests we have. Drummond, you know him really well. He did a number of webinars with us already and has been like a key member of the team for SSI Meetup. And I thank you so much, Vaughan, Chris, and Drummond, for making this possible and to sharing what happened like 2 months ago in Seattle.
Alex, thanks very much. I actually shared with Vaughan and Chris after we did the event in Seattle that this would make an ideal SSI Meetup webinar, and here we are. So I'm going to hand it over to Vaughan and Chris to do introductions. Vaughan, do you want to start out?
Yeah. Hey, Alex, Drummond, Chris, great to be here with you guys. My background is in cybersecurity. I've spent most of my career in that space. I'm CEO and founder of Datafi Labs, which is kind of digging deep into the issues around data security. Most recently spent a bunch of time in the IoT space, so identity was really top of mind for our team as we thought about what the evolution of identity really means. I'm looking forward to the conversation here and sharing some of our ideas.
Excellent. Chris?
Yeah, fantastic. Well, you know, for those of you who saw the early invitations here, you may have noticed Tony Little is a name on the presentation who's no longer with us. Tony had a conflict and couldn't make it today. So I'm wearing 2 hats. In the first hat, I will be representing Tony in a discussion around healthcare. And my background here comes from over 10 years in the healthcare space. I've been with Fortune 500 enterprises. I was with McKesson for 5 years, and also around the startup space, looking at how emerging technologies are impacting healthcare. So this is a space from the healthcare perspective that I have a lot of background in. I have a degree in health informatics, and I'm excited to kind of introduce the topic and then hand it off to, well, myself, who will then be representing the T-Mobile brand. I am currently the principal architect for emerging technologies, including blockchain at T-Mobile. And we have spent a lot of time thinking about how blockchain and self-sovereign identity in particular are emerging to impact our business and the businesses that we interface with. So we're really excited to be here talking about these topics, and really appreciate the opportunity.
Super. And as Alex said, many SSI Meetup folks have seen my earlier webinars. I'm Chief Trust Officer at Evernym, which is a commercial vendor of SSI products and solutions. And at the Sovrin Foundation, I'm one of the founding trustees and the chair of the Governance Framework Working Group. It used to be called the Trust Framework Working Group. Both terms are used. And so I'll be providing an update on how SSI infrastructure is going to support this $1 trillion business opportunity. So we'll go ahead and dive right into Chris in doing his best imitation of Tony Little.
Yeah, so kicking off this conversation, we really wanted to start with what healthcare looks like and why this is such an important topic to healthcare today. In the healthcare space, we've spent a long time looking at how identity is impacting individuals and how data interchange will grow to become a more and more important part of that conversation. And for those of you who are familiar with the topic of self-sovereign identity, and I assume that's most of our audience today, we don't need to really dig too deep before we get to Drummond's portion, digging into the ins and outs. But the highlight of it is that self-sovereign identity presents for us an opportunity for individuals to own their identity information and to exchange it, verify it in ways that were previously unavailable. In the healthcare space, this has been, we call it the $1 trillion opportunity as we kick off this conversation, but this has really been, kind of the holy grail in healthcare is secure, reliable, traceable data interchange and identity management. And in this slide, we cover a couple of the key reasons why, but I'm going to break out from the dollars that are listed here and just talk a little bit about kind of the history of where this comes from. In the healthcare space, Congress has had a mandate for many years to report on building a nationwide network of health information exchange. And identity is one of the key pieces that has really been a challenge in accomplishing that objective. So every year as the report has been delivered to Congress by HHS, it's been kind of a variety of reasons why we have not yet accomplished this task of building a nationwide network for health information exchange. And as recently as 2015, HHS actually delivered a new version of the report, which didn't say, here's how we're making progress, but it said, here's why we're not going to accomplish this. And they changed the conversation entirely. And what we believe today is that blockchain and self-sovereign identity are emerging to change that and give us an opportunity to roll back to a point in time where we could say we have the technology and the capability to deliver on solutions like a nationwide network of health information exchange and bring new capabilities to patients, to providers, to payers who participate in this healthcare system and allow them to really deliver on the promise that's been sitting in front of us for quite some time. From a dollars perspective, the healthcare space, depending on who you ask and how you calculate it, looks something around 20% of GDP in the United States today, and that is just a massive number. And how much of that interfaces with our identity is most of it, frankly. We've highlighted out in this slide a couple of key spaces, from coordination of benefits to provider data management, eligibility checks, medical record deduping, drug seeking, and patient member recon, that we specifically call out some spaces, but in reality, it gets way beyond this. These are the kind of top level spaces that correlate to how identity in the future, leveraging SSI, will impact the various parts of the healthcare system. But when you get below the surface level, you run into scenarios like, how does an individual get access to emergency care when they're out of state and maybe they're unconscious, right? There are all these kind of break the glass and fringe scenarios in healthcare that we just haven't had solutions for how identity can be managed. And leveraging new technologies like SSI, we have today a new opportunity to really get beyond what we've done in the past and deliver new capabilities in secure and traceable ways. So we're really excited about this. We're really excited about this conversation, this webinar. And with that, I'll go ahead and kick off to myself from T-Mobile and move on to the next slide and start talking about how this is starting to impact other spaces in the industry. So at T-Mobile, we've been connected to what's going on around blockchain and identity for a couple of years now. We are members of the World Wide Web Consortium's Verifiable Credentials Working Group, who looks to build some of the data models and other work around enabling self-sovereign identity. And we've worked with Drummond and others for almost that long. in building out some of the core capabilities of self-sovereign identity. Through our partners at Deutsche Telekom, who we work very closely with here at T-Mobile US, we are a founding steward of the Sovrin network and have been really active in participating in both kind of looking at the vision for how this technology is going to impact everyone around us and our business, as well as working on some of the technologies and standards that underlie it. Now, I'm really excited to be here representing T-Mobile and talking about this, but more than just talking about it, I'm excited about how this technology is emerging, how mobile operators are growing to address the needs in this space, and what we see as a huge opportunity. If we progress to the next slide. Oh, awesome. So we've got a couple of visuals here, just kind of highlighting some of the work that we've been doing, from working with the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, the Hyperledger project. The Next Directory solution is an identity management platform that we've built to address not self-sovereign identity, but identity governance. How do we, within enterprises and organizations, consortiums, manage identity characteristics of the people that are relevant to us? And then from there, how do we interface with self-sovereign networks to interchange that identity information? Okay, go ahead and continue on. Great. So this is some of the most exciting stuff from my perspective that's emerging in the mobile operator space to support self-sovereign identity. What you see here are logos of a couple of the key players in the space. ARM Trust Zone, Apple's A12 Bionic, and Titan Security represent some of the biggest names in handset and chip manufacturing. And why these are on the screen today, why this is relevant to the conversation around self-sovereign identity, if you haven't drawn the connection already, it boils back to trusted enclaves and how we bring self-sovereign identity to consumers. Device manufacturers today and the mobile operators like T-Mobile, who put those devices in people's hands, see that there is a changing tide from a security perspective. We do a lot of thinking about security and trust, and that's really critical to our business. And trust is something that, data from PricewaterhouseCoopers recently shows that 88% of consumers will make decisions about who they trust with their data based on the trustworthiness of them. And 87% would leave a partner that they work with based on misuse of data. So it's really critical for us to make sure that we are bringing the latest and greatest security and trust technologies to our consumers and the people running on the T-Mobile network. And it's also critical to us to make sure that we're leading the game, right? T-Mobile is not a follower in this space. We are, we have this brand of the Un-carrier. And it's because we do the things other people aren't willing to do, to get out and get in front of people and lead the way. And self-sovereign identity is absolutely one of those spaces that we're excited about. So there are two sides of how self-sovereign identity is really going to be, from my opinion, impacted by what's happening in the mobile operator space. First is the experience of interfacing with self-sovereign identity. That experience today is challenging, right? And Drummond and Vaughan may touch on this as well, but the reality is that managing keys is problematic. Really interfacing with blockchains in general is a challenging space today. And so as a company who puts devices in people's hands, it's really important to us to make experiences that are wonderful and provide those to our customers. And so we're excited to work with folks like Drummond and others in the self-sovereign identity space to not just solve the technical problems and bring new solutions to, and I think we're seeing some screen changes here from Drummond.
Sorry.
Yeah, so we're excited to bring along the experience of interfacing with self-sovereign identity, but to my earlier point, we're excited to bring along security of it. So if you want to kind of click through, Drummond, the ARM Trust Zone is an example the
Oops, sorry.
trusted execution, no, that's just fine. The trusted execution environment being leveraged to build a chipset repository for storing cryptographic materials. And as we look to mobile devices as a potential repository for wallets of crypto assets, whether it's self-sovereign identity-based assets or other crypto assets that we'll begin interfacing with in the future or today, the way that we provide security for those is really critical. And mobile devices are simultaneously the best and the worst place to keep crypto assets, right? I think that for a lot of you on the security side, and certainly Vaughan knows this, when you talk about storing crypto assets, the words of advice from cybersecurity professionals are keep them offline, keep them in cold storage, keep them as far from the internet as you can, right? And
yeah, for sure.
and your mobile device is absolutely the opposite of that, right? It's always on, it's always connected, it's got a real-time internet connection that, you know, is quickly moving into the 5G space where you'll have millisecond response times and gigabit bandwidth, and that is terrifying. So how do we you know, address that security risk while bringing improvements into the experience of interfacing with identity? And you can go ahead and click through, Drummond, to the next portions too. Apple's A12 Bionic is another example of how we're doing that, right? Today, they are leveraging this for your wallet on your iPhone, but they are not yet supporting the crypto curves that are needed for traditional either Bitcoin or Ethereum based tokens. But that's something that's right there in the future. Their crypto kit is building APIs to more easily interface and allow application providers to start to leverage these trusted execution environments. For those of you who aren't familiar, and we can go ahead and click through in the next section, TitanM is another example of that Google is producing. Trusted execution environments are secure either physically unique chips on your device or separated while on the same die spaces on the chip. They generally run their own separate memory space. They run their own computation space, and they're completely isolated from the operating system. And this gives the capability to, you know, we call them reverse sandboxes. So in a traditional sandbox, like maybe runs in your browser, you have a space that if there is malicious code being executed, your operating system is protected from it. In a reverse sandbox, like a trusted execution environment, if your operating system is compromised, that execution environment, that reverse sandbox, is still protected there. So by running a separate memory space, a separate chip space, these trusted execution environments allow us to protect crypto assets while potentially having a compromised operating system sitting over the top of them. So this is the space, or one of the key spaces, that we're really focusing our energy and our interest as we look towards the future of the security of devices, and how we bring both wonderful experiences to customers interfacing with self-sovereign identity, and how we make sure that we lead the way from a security standpoint while we do that. And I think that's what I have for right now. I think you can click to the next slide and you'll find a kickoff to, yeah, Vaughan's section.
Chris, before we move on, it's great to hear the CIO at T-Mobile, Cody, talk publicly about self-sovereign identity, and you mentioned a little bit of it here, but what can we see coming out of T-Mobile and the mobile operator space in general to kind of embrace the next step in SSI? Is that something we're going to see this year, next year?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. So like you said, we've had a lot of great support both internally around the organization for the ways that we look at identity, as well as from our C-suite. Cody Sanford has been in Forbes and CIO Review recently talking about self-sovereign identity. These are topics that, you know, are at the forefront of mind all the way to the top of this organization. And so that's a really powerful story for us. And as technologists within the company, when we look at the future, we realize that it's not just something that we're excited about as you know, the geeks who are into this stuff, but as something that really can impact our business. So as far as timelines, we are all still working aggressively to solve some of these key problems. I think Drummond may be able to speak more appropriately into that space, but things like, things that I see from my ground level and my perspective are the work that we're doing with the W3C and verifiable credentials. That data model is just getting prepared to be published as a 1.0. And so what that means to me is the standards that sit behind interoperability of self-sovereign identity and other next generation identity interchange formats are still being established. So we are building those today based on the use cases we see in front of us. We have technologies that are rolling out today, like again, I'm sure Evernym is engaged with, that are taking advantage of this stuff. But as far as a broad adoption and interoperable stance, I think we're still probably looking to the future for that. We're really excited to be a part of building that future, but it's coming fast.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, that's it. It's coming fast. We need it, for a bunch of different reasons. I'll talk about cybersecurity next and why we need to embrace digital identity.
Yeah, and maybe we'll just real quick, Vaughan, sorry to interrupt, but Alex, if there are any questions from the audience at this stage, we can take a couple of questions real quick before we pass it off.
Yeah, we have one question that came up just a minute ago. It's saying, have you come up with a solution for the fact that neither TEE nor the secure element can display data securely? So he's saying like a nano ledger displays what you're about to sign, for example.
Yeah, and so that really touches on a TEE, a trusted execution environment, is another word for these secure enclaves, right? It's this isolated space in both memory and processing that allows you to store crypto secrets. And the way that you interface between those secure enclaves, those TEEs, and device level applications or things that a user can interface with is very limited, right? And it by rule needs to be that way in order to maintain its security. So there are still, in the case of, say, Apple has built CryptoKit. It's a set of APIs that allows developers to interface with their secure enclave and do so in a way that kind of follows all the appropriate rules and maintains levels of security. But it's something that's one of the spaces and one of the reasons why I think this is the most exciting space in technology today is both because of the opportunity in front of us, the potential for impact in the way that we do business, the way that we seek healthcare, the way that we exchange information amongst one another, the way that we as businesses look at, how do we verify the credentials of somebody applying for a role? There are real hairy challenges around this still, technical challenges that are going to be really fantastic to see being addressed over the coming months.
Awesome. There's one more from Nathan. Are your product teams involved in discounted plans for businesses thinking about verification?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that for me?
Yeah, he's saying, are your product teams involved in discounted plans for businesses thinking about verification?
Yeah, I can't speak to plans about future activities or operations or how we might interface with businesses. What I can say is that, when you have your C-suite sending a message about technologies that they're excited about and that they think represent the future, that percolates down through an entire organization. So we're really excited about this space, and I think we can leave it there.
I think that's it for the time being, and Nathan is saying thank you, and he will reach out to his account manager. Okay, so I'll Drummond, Vaughan is next, right?
Yeah, over to you, Vaughan.
All right, awesome. So I'm going to just talk for the next few minutes about the current state of information technology, cybersecurity, and what are the drivers in my mind that are forcing the industry as a kind of a broad ecosystem to think more about digital identity and less about some of the traditional solutions that we've used, all username and password. So current state is that I think IDs and passwords are too easily compromised. We see data breaches where hackers and general bad people go after those assets first, and they try to exploit those. So we want to get away from that type of architecture. The global data sphere is growing exponentially, and to give everybody kind of a context of what data sphere is, it's data that we are generating from every one of our devices, personal devices, our corporate devices, the infrastructure that runs the internet, and all of the systems that feed that. So the global data sphere is growing rapidly, and we just simply kind of acknowledge that we might need some different approaches in dealing with that. Compounded with the number of connected devices. We all carry mobile phones. We probably have several devices at home that are running our smart homes, and IoT as 5G really becomes mainstream will find its own, and we'll see a world where things are just rapidly connecting. Those are the catalysts that are changing kind of the world of information technology that we live in. So let's advance one. There we go. Okay, the data problem is where I want to spend a little bit of time talking about it. It's one of the primary drivers for digital identity, the need for digital identity. We're at the early stage of this concept of a global digital transformation, which is really created by the opportunity for cloud computing and cloud storage. There's a massive amount of infrastructure that is now driving business systems that are generating this volume of data, and it's great being in Seattle. We've got Amazon Web Services here, we've got Microsoft Azure, and Google's putting a big cloud presence here. So we see a lot of the foundational things in place that are going to drive this growth. And the little red dot is truly where we are today, right? We're at I wouldn't even say it's the midpoint. I would say that's still at an early stage of where we're generating data, and then 175 billion terabytes is 175 zettabytes. So it's just a massive number, and that data sphere is the target for hackers and general bad guys trying to disrupt the networks. So what we've got is essentially data is our most valuable asset. If we think about kind of what it is, it's data, it's our personal data, it's our corporate data. That's the most valuable asset. And one of the weakest links is our traditional authentication methods of user ID and password. So point number one, the data problem. Let's go to the next slide. Where is this data coming from? To give you kind of a perspective, as Chris spoke for Tony, healthcare is in the top 5 categories of where the volume of data is originating, but not surprising, healthcare is the fastest growing space. So it's a combination of enterprise data and a massive amount of social media data, which is in the kind of the other column there. So it's coming from everywhere, and our ability to deal with that really necessitates a change in our thinking around cybersecurity and specifically around digital identity to protect that data. So let's go one more. The other side of the data coin is the kind of the device space, the number of devices that are coming online, and specifically we're going to see a huge growth around 5G. So when 5G becomes kind of real, that's where IoT kind of finds its own. I've spent a bunch of years in that space, and the foundational pieces are being laid for IoT, but really when the network is there, we're going to see just a radical change. 150 billion devices is arguably an aggressive estimate. You can cut that in half and it's still a really, really big number. At that volume, it's about 20 connected devices per person. And we got to start thinking about how do we uniquely identify those devices. We simply don't want to use our user ID and password for pick your service, whether it's a Google service or Apple service or other services. User ID and password as the method to identify what devices are ours, or within an enterprise, an admin or a root password to identify those devices as the corporation. Those approaches and that architecture is way in the past, and we just got to come to grips with the way we use computers are very different. The types of devices, just to kind of give folks a sense of what this looks like, the diagram on the right, mobile devices and our computers, that's where we start. But in this future point, it's a handful of other new devices: autonomous vehicles, IoT devices, bots that run on behalf of us, and things that happen on the manufacturer floor, or things that happen in kind of a retail setting. AV and AR is out there, but also represent a significant number of new devices coming online. So the combination of a lot of data plus a lot of devices is, in my opinion, kind of the salient point of, okay, let's think about this in a different way. And in a little bit, we're going to talk about self-sovereign identity and what that means kind of from the ground up. What can we do with that technology that is rapidly maturing to help solve some of these alarming cybersecurity trends? So one more. To kind of drive that home on what or why we need to do something different, the data security industry has been tracking data theft for a very long time. This website's an interesting one for folks to kind of go out and just play around with, but there's no shortage of data breaches. And again, those hackers and bad guys and organized crime and rogue states, and those are real. This is what they're looking for. They're looking for username and passwords. They're looking for credentials. They're looking for personal identifiable information that's not properly been encrypted, in order to kind of sell those in what we refer to as the dark web, where folks can go, they can buy this information, and they can use it to try to impersonate our identities and open up credit cards and loans, and it really gets kind of bad from there. So it's hard statistics and hard facts, but they're real. So let's just go one more. Through when I was doing the research for this talk, I spent a little bit of time thinking about kind of the dark web and the number of identity records that are out there for sale. And again, these are primarily user ID passwords, maybe our social security numbers, some type of PII, which stands for personal identifiable information. The industry term is we look at kind of putting categories around data. PII is a really big one. Nearly 15 billion identity records available on the dark web. That's 3 pieces of identifiable information per person alive today, which is just a phenomenal number. The interesting thing here is that only 4% of the online information sits kind of in the web as we think it. 90% of information online kind of sits in that deep web. That's corporate data. It's more sensitive data, and it's data that I think that technologies like self-sovereign identity and the use of digital identity really can help protect from the dark web, which is the 6% that none of us really want to go search for, because it's it's a place that you want to avoid. So let's go one more. There we go. So where do we go from here? The use of digital identity is viewed by many, including me and the speakers here, as one of the primary methods to counter these trends, to shift from what would otherwise be pretty easy to use, my user ID, my password, to a form of digital identity that is linked to pieces of hardware, as Chris mentioned, inside of secure storage on a mobile phone, and we all carry mobile phones. So we have the technology that allows us to abandon the old approach, IDs and passwords, to a new approach, biometrics, mobile phones, and then that device becomes essentially our passport to systems. Our social media, online social media can be authenticated through that device with some form of self-sovereign identity. Corporate systems can use the phone to validate that, that in fact I'm Vaughan. I can log into my corporate account. I can do it from my office. If I'm in another part of the world, or somebody's trying to log in from another part of the world, the systems need to get smarter and know that I couldn't possibly be there and be here. So that must obviously be somebody trying to impersonate me or hack that computer system. So that's the direction we need to go. And Drummond's going to kind of take us through some of the nuts and bolts of how to implement that.
Thanks very much, Vaughan. Before I do that, you and I met here in Seattle, which I agree is a home for cloud computing, and I think one of the places, one of the SSI hotspots. But I was fascinated that someone coming out of a whole career in cybersecurity would laser in on SSI as the place you next wanted to build on. Tell folks a little bit more about why you made that decision, and why, of all the forms of digital identity, SSI is the one you're aiming at now.
Yeah, I really did kind of fall in love with SSI and the concepts. For the past several years, I worked in the IoT space, and we had built cybersecurity technology for IoT, intended to protect data as it moved from the edge to cloud. And then we took the next step of creating identity and trust infrastructure to allow things to identify other things, and then kind of build into that method a trust layer. Well, as I began thinking about the enterprise data sphere problem, it became really obvious that user ID and passwords were not sufficient. We couldn't use those credentialing for encryption, which was really key. And self-sovereign identity and the work that you're doing through Sovrin and other affiliations really, I thought, was the path forward, to use a form of digital identity that I would own. It would be mine. I could bring it to my work, and I could use that as the method to authenticate, but also the method to encrypt. And that combination was just, it was really great to see. And I love that the Pacific Northwest does have such an SSI foundation. There's a lot of cool stuff going on out here. So that was the reason I kind of went that direction.
Super. Of course, I'm a #1 fan of that, and that's why I'm here. And what I covered in the Seattle Blockchain Consortium was just making sure that all the developers out there in the audience were very clear. When we say SSI, what do we mean? And what does the stack look like? Where's the code? And that's what I'll be covering here. Many folks, that are regulars watching these webinars, you're going to see many of the same slides. I'll just try and provide some updates. Before I do that, just a quick check. Any questions in the queue for Vaughan, Alex?
No, right now that we're good.
Okay. All right, so I'll dive through this, and then we'll do full Q&A at the end. So this is my SSI in 3 easy steps. Many folks, again, have seen these slides before, so I'll be fairly quick. We start with, of course, the original model, and exactly what Vaughan was just talking about, the username password model, where you only exist on the internet because you have an account someplace with the username and password. And pre-internet, this was fine in our localized systems, but once we got the internet, it really became very painful, and that's pain we're still suffering today. So then the solution was the federated identity model, where we said, okay, let's put a service provider in the middle. You have an account there, they turn around and federate your identity out to all the organizations and systems that trust that identity provider. And 3 generations of protocols were developed to enable this federated identity, thinking that was the way to solve the problem. But it's really, other than SSO systems used within enterprises, and the very, very large social sign-on systems that we use, log in with Google or Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn, that's as far as it's gotten. It's hit a wall in terms of these identities are not portable. They're very limited to what the identity provider is able to do. They insert I love the phrase John Jordan of BC.gov uses. It's a middleman. It's a designed in man in the middle attack to any of your relationships. It just hasn't been the long-term solution. So I show this because the step to step 3, self-sovereign identity, is a radical change in architecture. It says there's a fundamentally different way to approach this. And we move from account-based relationships back to the internet model of peer-to-peer relationships, where it's not an account, it's called a connection. Now, in this one slide, I try and build, why is this now possible? Why can we go to this peer-to-peer when, based on blockchain and distributed ledger technology? What is the problem that it solves there? And the short answer is, each of you in all these relationships are represented by an agent. And that's a very, very generic word. It corresponds to things like user agents for browsers that we've had for years. But in distributed autonomous systems, that's what the actors are all called, regardless of what they represent. So these agents here, yes, obviously you individuals, but the agents you can be interacting with are other individuals. It can be organizations or any organizational division of an organization, or it can be a thing of any kind. It can be a group of any kind. So it's all agent to agent. And the way in which you're establishing the security and privacy of those connections is you each have a digital wallet. It each has the private keys and the verifiable credentials. We'll talk to more in a minute. So as you establish these connections, they're all trusted, encrypted, secure connections, and then the trust is established by the exchange of verifiable credentials between the two parties in either direction. So how do you know you can trust those credentials? Because they're digitally signed. And how can you verify that you have the public key of the other party? That's where the blockchain comes in. And the key supporting standard, as Chris mentioned, is DIDs, decentralized identifiers. I'm the co-editor of the DID spec at the W3C. I'm happy to report that it's been, over 18 months in the credentials community group, but we are a few days away from the end of a vote at the W3C for a full DID working group. This is the first identifier that the W3C will be getting behind, forming a working group to create a full public standard for, since the development of the original URLs that the entire web is based on. It's the first one where they've said, and again, we got to see the outcome of the vote. It's still possible it wouldn't make it for some reason, but if it does succeed, it will be the W3C members saying, yes, we now see that decentralization, cryptographically verifiable identifiers, and ability to find and verify a public key for another party is become a critical feature on the web. And the reason is, that's how we get to decentralized PKI, public key infrastructure. It's a long-standing problem. Today, all our PKI is centralized. Every browser ships with a set of certificate authorities that are wired into the browser, and it is that group of the web trust group of browser manufacturers that determine the trust infrastructure for the internet. It's not governments, it's not standards bodies, it's a set of browser manufacturers. With SSI and DIDs, we can move now to distributed, decentralized, highly trusted infrastructure that leverages blockchain. So I like to summarize it. If all that seemed very deep, let's never lose facts of the fight. We all know how to do self-sovereign identity today offline using every wallet, every credential that we have. What we don't know how to do is to do it online, to do it digitally, and that's what we're able to do. Now I'm going to go a little deeper into it by saying verifiable credentials. If you haven't seen this diagram, it's the heart of how it all works. issuers of credentials like a passport or a driver's license or a medical credential like a healthcare plan. Those issuers get their own DID. They use that to digitally sign the credential that's given to the holder of the credential, who is also going to the one that's going to produce proofs. They store it in their digital wallet, and that typically, as Chris pointed out, will not just be on the phone. It will be in a secure element on the phone, or on whatever device you're using to do that, because it's digital wallet technology is not limited to mobile devices. They just are what really make it practical to use. And when that comes up and people ask, well, really, what's the experience going to be like? I just say, have you used a mobile boarding pass to board a plane, any place in the world? And 95% of the hands in the room go up, and I go, that's the experience right there. You have a credential in a digital wallet on your mobile phone today, and you used it to get on a plane. That's the level of trust that was needed. That's a very, very dedicated system to a specific kind of digital credential that's needed for air travel. What we're doing with verifiable credentials is we're making it general. We're doing for that what the web did for hypertext, is move away from dedicated systems to a general system that anyone can use for any type of credential. And the power of this is it means that verifiers who need those proofs can now accept digital credentials under their own terms from any issuer anywhere and verify them, and verify also using the right technology that they have been revoked or not revoked without contacting the issuer. There doesn't have to be any relationship between the verifier and the issuer. All they need to be able is to contact the DID network, a public or even a private blockchain, but whatever's necessary for that verifier to get to the public key information and the credential revocation information to know, is that credential valid? That's the infrastructure we're creating. Now, just to make sure it's clear, the heart of it is this trust triangle, right? All the reason your credentials work in your wallet today is because verifiers trust those credentials from specific issuers. They make up their own policies for when they do that. And we're just taking this whole thing and moving it online. Now, one of the questions is, how do you scale that, right? The only really globally acceptable credentials in our wallets today, our physical wallets, have huge networks behind them. It's the global passport system, or it's the credit cards we're using. Many others of those credentials are much more local. So the answer there is you add a second level of trust triangles, which we call governance frameworks. Governance authorities create these, and then they can actually provide verifiable credentials of who are the authorized issuers under that. And now a verifier just simply needs two proofs. A good example here, the credit union industry has formed a governance authority called CU Ledger. They're standardizing a credential of credit union membership. CU Ledger will issue a verifiable credential to every credit union that signs up and is certified to issue that MyCUID credential. And now a verifier with just two proofs. You have MyCUID, and your credit union can provide a proof that they are authorized under CU Ledger, and every verifier in the world will be able to verify you have a KYC-backed credit union identity. And the governance framework for that is in process. By the way, an update on that, they just issued the first 900 production credentials at the first credit union, Desert Schools in southwestern United States. So it's happening. All right, just quickly wrapping this up into the overall, what's often called the SSI stack. From a overall architectural perspective, you can see how these layers have emerged, and they are very, very, become very clear and architecturally distinct. Public ledger networks at the bottom level. The second level is where you have all the off ledger peer-to-peer activity between agents and wallets. And an important point there is that the connections that are made there by default are using pairwise pseudonymous private peer DIDs that do not need to go on a ledger. They don't have any cost involved with them other than the cloud services that are behind them. And this is where mobile technology and leadership such as we're seeing from Chris and T-Mobile are absolutely critical to the adoption of this infrastructure, because that's going to be that primary tool for running an agent and being able to support the credential exchange that we explained at layer 3. And again, the scalability and ultimately the trustability of this infrastructure by regulators comes from layer 4 of those governance frameworks. And I want to make a note for any folks. I chair the governance framework working group at the Sovrin Foundation. Just last night, we published in public review a set of revisions of the Sovrin governance framework we've been working on for the last 6 months. Collaboration among the 70 stewards of the Sovrin network and our counsel, the Perkins Coie law firm, and regulators that we've been consulting about the whole thing to basically address how will sovereign, self-sovereign identity infrastructure work with global data protection regulations like GDPR in Europe or CCPA in the US or the Canadian regulations. And there's been tension there because those regulations always assume there's some organization that is acting as your data controller when you give it some data. They never anticipated that individuals could actually control their own data. So there was some tension there, and it took a lot of work. So if you're interested in that, just Google Sovereign Governance Framework, SOVRIN, Governance Framework. It'll go right to the page, and you can preview the documents that have been prepared to solve that problem. So I want to make sure anyone that's new to this and says, where's the code? At least I'm going to answer that question from the standpoint of Hyperledger. The open source project, the Linux Foundation for blockchain technology. It has steadily grown more and more SI support. The first project was Hyperledger Indy, contributed by the Sovrin Foundation. That's 2 years ago. It's become one of the most active projects there. The next thing that happened is the crypto there, especially the zero knowledge crypto, set a sort of new bar, and it was decided that all of Hyperledger should collaborate on a shared crypto library that's now called URSA. That's now out and has really got a fantastic set of cryptographers that are collaborating now on the shared crypto library. And then to fully support the higher layers above the ledger, the latest project announced in May was Hyperledger Aries, which again supports any form of off-ledger interaction. So to map this into the stack, at least from a Hyperledger perspective, now got Hyperledger Indy specifically as a SSI optimized ledger for DIDs, and then you've got Aries supporting the code base for agents and wallets and credential exchange that will be, include Indy and, this is important, any other DID supported system. And another key evolutionary step there is for the Aries code base to support all 3 of the credential formats in the verifiable credential 1.0 data model that Chris mentioned. That's now a candidate recommendation. I think it's at the 2nd level candidate recommendation at W3C. It should be fully finished this fall. And there are 3 types of credential signatures supported in there. The ZKP format that Aries has been using, but also the JOT format from the Jose stack, and a JSON LD format that uses JSON linked data signatures. The goal now is for Aries to support all 3 of those so that we can have interoperable credentials throughout the ecosystem. And lastly, as I mentioned, up at the governance level, you've got the work Sovrin's been doing in the Sovrin Governance Framework, which is also expanding to become multi-network, what we call the network of networks. And that's such a big topic. I hope we have another webinar on it here soon. So that's my coverage of sort of what we're building to go after this $1 million opportunity. So let's turn it over to questions.
Yeah, awesome. We have one question right now, but I encourage everyone to jump in. And this one is from Vince for Vaughan. So just give me a sec. I just need to make this bigger. Give me one moment. I have a couple of them accumulating here. Okay, so here's the question for Vaughan. He's saying, bit of a broad question. I work for a telecommunications company, and I'm actually having some trouble convincing our IoT department to start looking at SSI based concepts for IoT. Any tips for that? Are there resources available that link to problems or emerging problems in our IoT to tangible solutions using SSI, for instance?
Great question, and I recognize the need that that he's identifying is kind of getting the powers that be to kind of think about digital identity and SSI. I think Drummond had just kind of, if we can go back to that one slide of all of the Hyperledger projects. Yeah, let's see.
One more, hang on.
Yeah. So, Drummond, I'd invite you to kind of comment here as well. I mean, I think the starting point would be to dig into Hyperledger and understand kind of the foundation for SSI at that point, and then Aries as the peering mechanism between IoT devices. Drummond, does that sound like the right path to go down?
Absolutely, that is right on. Aries is focused, and for this I will actually go to the next slide and just point out, and I'll get it up here. So Aries is specifically in because this is layers 2 and 3 are all peer-to-peer. And one of the big thrusts to do that, to realize that we had to break out of a dependency of involving a blockchain with all of the transactions, interactions, is the scale that IoT needs. Mm-hmm. So the Aries code base is definitely being designed. There are multiple, IoT groups represented in the Aries development discussions. And specifically at layer 2, you'll notice the protocol has been christened DIDCOM. It is all DID-to-DID communications, and the requirements for that protocol for IoT devices, of course, you need very lightweight, in some cases very low bandwidth or low or long latency. Those are definitely all being considered so that layer 2 will operate, and and the minimal credentials needed at layer 3 for IoT devices. So the one other thing I'll mention is the potential or the demand for SSI with IoT is strong enough that when the Sovereign Governance Framework Working Group finished our second generation in March, and we said, okay, now we're going to form a set of task forces for folks that want to focus on specific areas. One of the first to form was a SSI and IoT task force. Mm-hmm. Now that's looking at a lot of the issues the upper the governance layer around that, because you got devices all over and they all have some kind of controller, personal organization, and it can get fairly complex. But the level of interest in that task force has really been very heartening. So if you're looking for more justification and use cases, they're focused on that right now around SSI and IoT. Just drop Alex a note here, leave him your email address, and he'll send me a note. I can put you directly in touch, or you can just go to the Sovereign. There's a blog post on those. Search for Sovereign Governance Task Forces, and there's a blog post that shows how you can join that group.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in there. I think we all have a lot of experience in having these conversations and building this dialogue. If there's any value in hearing from somebody in the telecom space who's had these conversations and built this message internally and said, this is an important thing that we need to be thinking about into the future, and elevated it up through the organization, that's something that I've got experience with, and I'd be happy to, if it's appropriate based on your organization, to have that conversation with me, have that conversation with you. So feel free to reach out to any one of us, and we can all help build this. This is something that is fundamentally shifting the way that we interface with devices, the way devices interface with one another, and the way that we interface with each other. So we're really excited, all of us, as you can tell.
Now that's something you can only get on an SSI meetup webinar, an invitation from Chris Spanton to involve him in convincing your management to go into SSI.
I mean, Vince, he just shared his email with me. Is it okay if I connect all of you with him?
Sounds good.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So then you guys are connected, and hopefully that will help him in his company. Also, just gonna mention quickly, Rins, for your benefit and for everyone else's benefit, Heather Vesson, she just shared a report she did some time ago. I shared that report right now in Twitter, so you have access to that report in Twitter to check it out. She says it's about that intersection between SSI and IoT and the legal aspects of identity, so that might be helpful too.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because as soon as you said that, I remember that Heather was working on a report specifically in that area. So yeah, look for that tweet, because I think that's going to be golden.
Awesome. So another question here from Yoti, she's asking, what would be users' involvement in running peers? Do they have to own a peer in the blockchain? And this is a question for Drummond and for anyone else who might want to jump in.
Sure, that's a simple and short answer. No, you do not need to. At layer 2, running agent and wallets on all your devices, and having corresponding what we call cloud agents when you need them, do not need to involve running any nodes on the blockchain. They use the blockchain for trust verification, but you're not running a node of a blockchain itself. I know early SSI architectures contemplated that, and you know, the whole SSI ecosystem was on the blockchain, but there were a whole bunch of reasons, both scalability, privacy, that we realized that wasn't the right architecture. So you're not having to run a node of any blockchain when you're on an agent wallet.
Great. And so anyone else wants to share anything? If not, I'll go to the next question, which is from Rins, and he's also asking for Drummond. I'm wondering if you guys are trying to figure out how these connections and credential exchanges would work when one end of the connection is a smart contract or a DAO. We feel it's an interesting space where smart contracts can actually challenge you for verifiable credentials.
Absolutely. Just a huge yes to that. It's been interesting right from the very start. If you talk to Nathan George, CTO at the Sovrin Foundation, he will say that everything that needs to communicate about trust should be able to effectively act as an agent and speak the DIDCOM protocol, or be represented by an agent that does. So you could interact directly with a smart contract, or the smart contract could literally have an agent, because it too is something with identity that you need to intersect with. So I think that's a huge area. One of the things that's happening at Hyperledger and with the Decentralized Identity Foundation is that the call it the permissionless world of folks working primarily in Bitcoin or Ethereum have a very, very robust dialogue with folks that are working on called public permission architectures like Sovrin or other Hyperledger projects, and realizing, oh yeah, we all have the same problems, and we need to have these higher layers work across all these systems. So if you're looking at Ethereum, and we say bid networks and public ledgers down here, those include permission or permissionless. And so absolutely, smart contracts should be part of the agent ecosystem.
Okay, question from Fabio. He's asking, is a soft investment preserving transition from centralized or federated IAM to SSI possible, and how would it work? Who wants
to take that one?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I'll just kind of off the top suggest that to me, this is a generational shift. This is not an iterative technology change, and what we're probably looking at are a harder transition than maybe would be something that you're looking forward to. But I'm going to qualify that and say, you know, a lot of the things, a lot of the technologies that you're becoming familiar with in your organizations related to identity management in the old federated model, whether it's the you know, the JOT tokens that you're using or other solutions, a lot of those are going to be transitioning over, you know, again, to Drummond's point around how those Hyperledger projects are bringing together the technologies. While the infrastructure maybe that you're leveraging is likely to look at a kind of harder transition point, I think a lot of the technologies that underlie that are going to be familiar to your organization. Do you think that's fair to say, Drummond?
Yes, I definitely, I think that's right on. One of the, I think, hottest issues that has come up in SSI as sort of rubbers meeting the road, as you know, Vaughan and Chris were both answering, you know, where are we in the evolution of the technology? A sign of the growing maturity is that focus is moving to how do SSI-based systems work with deployed identity and access management infrastructure, IAM. A very, very hot topic is how does it work with OpenID based systems, right? They're both existing and some very large new deployments that are coming out that OpenID as a federation technology is quite mature at this point. But how do those systems where they're already trying to be user-centric, how do they take that next step? How does an agent and wallet actually talk to an OpenID system that's expecting to talk to an identity provider and not necessarily a repository of verifiable credentials? So very active projects working on that. I know it'll be a major topic at these upcoming conferences, which including Rebooting Web of Trust, which I think is next week in Prague, and then Internet Identity Workshop the first week of October in Mountain View, California.
Question from Timothy. He's asking, how close are we to getting a major super credible entity with lots of users to drive adoption?
Sorry,
yeah.
I'm
beyond the credit union, right? Something more mainstream, like a mobile operator.
Well, you know, I think there's a lot of examples of that, right? You know, there are certainly mobile operators, T-Mobile included, who are really excited about this space. But, you know, Drummond can speak to work that's being done by BC government. I heard him reference that. Microsoft is certainly heavily engaged in that space. There are other major large names who are putting a lot of energy into this. So I think it's not a question of how close are we to that. It's a question of who's listening to what's actually happening.
Yeah, and it's you know, it's a question. First of all, it's a very fair question. Second one is one we should expect when we're going to turn around and call a webinar the $1 trillion opportunity, because those are the things that attract the attention of very large entities. The reason I was smiling or laughing a little bit is that there are a handful of very specific projects that I'm involved with or Evernym is involved with, and we're only one of the folks involved with that I can't say anything about. It's not surprising that some of the largest entities out there that want to do something in this space they're just not saying anything until they're at a certain point. Now, Chris is absolutely right. Microsoft has been very vocal and straightforward about what they're doing, and I like to make the picture. They're working their way up the stack. They've done a huge amount of work down at the lower layer. They announced their side tree technology, and then the ION implementation that works with Bitcoin at layer 1. And they are very interested right now. You know, I think they've been very public about figuring out how it works with OpenID technology that they've invested a lot in already. So they're working their way up the stack, and I think expect to hear a lot more from Microsoft in the next 6 to 12 months. BC Gov, I think, is a great example. I mean, to have a government, and BC Gov is one of several active Canadian provinces. Alberta, also very public now about what they're doing with the Alberta credentials ecosystem. And Ontario has also been issuing business credentials together with BC Gov, since last December. And there's a lot of momentum developing among SSI, among them and the Canadian, I don't want to call it federal, they have a different term for it, but the national work going on up there, and DIAC, the Digital Identity and Authentication Council of Canada. So they're very active in the Hyperledger project, and they have very strong plans. And when you get a government that is putting real stake in the ground around using SSI, it's hard to get it's hard to appeal to any higher authorities than that. And they're certainly not the only government that's working on it. They're just the only one that I think at this point is very public about it.
Yeah, related question to this, also from Timothy, is asking what industries use cases have the most to gain from moving to SSI? What is the low-hanging fruit?
If Tony was here, he would probably step up and say healthcare, right? Because healthcare has, and I think between the three of us, we can draw from some of his comments at the Seattle session. Healthcare has these silos of systems, and just simple reconciliation between systems represent billion-dollar costs to the industry. So if through SSI across each of the different components of healthcare, and we saw some of those numbers at the opening slide, that represents a watershed savings in an industry where there's really high costs and there's a lot of pressure to reduce costs. So I think if Tony was here, he would step up and say healthcare is probably the number one or number two in the area of opportunity for savings and adoption.
Sure, and I'll just echo that and kind of highlight one of the points that I made earlier in the healthcare section, right? Healthcare spending today is somewhere in the neighborhood of 20% of the GDP. When you start measuring your industry's impact by percentage of GDP in the United States, you recognize that the opportunity space is massive. And healthcare is not that much because it costs that much to deliver care. There are many statistics that show that the quality of care delivered in the United States as opposed to other first world countries and the quantity of care delivered do not justify those numbers. So where is that? Those inefficiencies emerge and can be addressed through places like self-sovereign. So certainly there's a huge opportunity there. I'll take a quick moment and highlight one other space that I think is really compelling. I testified before the House and Senate in Washington State here on kind of the emergence of blockchain earlier this year and spent some time talking with the Lieutenant Governor, Cyrus Habib. And one of the things that he highlighted for me is that in Washington State, what we have is, and I'm sure this is replicated in many other places, but a large proportion, and there's some great numbers that you can look up to back this up. If anybody's interested, I can share those. A large proportion of students who go to university in this state don't finish that. And what happens with their experience and how do they become contributors to the economy of the state based on that information? And the reality is that they often don't. And so self-sovereign identity presents an opportunity with individuals owning their identity characteristics and identity verifiers, being able to identify identity claims against things like individual courses taken at universities. There is a huge opportunity to dramatically change the way that people interface with the educational system, and thus all of the other industries that they will interface with through their careers. When you start tracking people's educational and career background via self-sovereign identities in a verifiable way, there is a huge potential for impact on how diversity hiring changes, on how the verification of credentials changes, and that's one space that you can see with education, it impacting broad swaths of the economy.
I completely. Go ahead, Vaughan.
Oh, Drummond, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to just add just one more. I think industry sector where self-sovereign identity becomes kind of the catalyst for change, and that's smart cities. There's a lot of projects underway, both in the United States, Europe, and other parts of the world, where smart cities become kind of really meaningful. The value and the economic savings of a city that just simply connects the streetlights together. It's incredible the economic value of doing something as simple as that, or parking meters. But what we find is there are so many different vendors that kind of come to smart city projects where systems don't have this interoperability. So IoT is a really broad swath. Within that, I would say that another huge economic opportunity for SSI is inside of smart cities, where we can create identity and things can interoperate and begin to kind of realize some of the savings there. So that I was going to just add that as maybe in top 5 marketplace for self-sovereign identity.
It's definitely up there. I like it as I keep my top 5, top 6 list. We've hit all of them, assuming we include government, because we're seeing, as I said, real interest in adoption by government. That there's one other announcement I just saw since I got back from vacation, that kiva.org, kiva.org, announced that they've implemented a hyperledger-based self-sovereign identity system for Sierra Leone, the whole country. Right. It's I've known that they've been active in Hyperledger, but they've been fairly quiet until this is the first announcement I've seen where they've come public and said, yep, it's and Kiva's the largest micro-lending platform in the world, and they I've talked with them. They basically said, in order for us to keep growing the impact of micro-lending, we need identity that's compatible with it, and credit reporting that's compatible with it. And that's why they're looking at blockchain. And they said, we can get both from blockchain-based technologies, SSI, and then SSI-based microcredit, as obviously using verifiable credentials. So I think that's another, and that's actually going to be the last segment I was going to point out. In addition to governments, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, they depend very heavily on the relationships with all of the parties that, the volunteers, the donors, the projects they're supporting. They need identity. They always have. But they've struggled with it, both because of the cost and difficulty, but also because they have a very challenging set of very distributed identity challenges. And they're seeing that SSI it feels like it was made for them. So I think, even though it might not be a high dollar volume segment in terms of the impact and adoption and awareness, it can be very significant.
And let me just put a bow on that, Drummond. For those of you who aren't familiar, Kiva also was engaged with the UN World Food Bank in their early program to use blockchain and identity technologies to bring food to refugees in camps. And this is, we can take this quick segue to look at not just the corporate side and the business perspective on how identity is emerging and how that interfaces with governments. But to Drummond's point, there is a whole world of NGOs that impact human rights and how people are able to move around the world. That self-sovereign identity is preparing to dramatically change. So when you look at what the last decade of refugee crises have brought to the world, and when you imagine the impact of self-sovereign identity that's portable and transportable with individuals, and how that can impact their interfacing with the world system, I think that it's just really clear to anybody who's got familiarity with the space that the opportunity is massive, if not in dollars, then if in human impact.
And we have, that reminds me, Chris, that ID 2020, this several year old organization devoted to going after that, is having their next conference in New York, and I think it's mid-September. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to be there, but I know a number of folks are. And if you're interested in that, id2020.org, I believe is where that's going on.
Great. Awesome.
Excellent. We have 3 more questions in the pipeline. So if anyone else has a question, just shoot ahead. If not, we will do these 3 more. So one more question from Fabio. He's asking, could verifiable credentials also represent assets, and how would the evolution be transacted?
I'll just highlight real quick, and Drummond, I'm sure you can chime in. And I think we've touched on a lot of this, but the reality is that, from my perspective, when we look at self-sovereign identity, we're not talking about people or devices explicitly or at cost of other things. Really, we look at anything that can be represented by an identity. That's a block of code, that's a piece of equipment, that is a human being. There are, don't limit your thinking to these use cases that are being put in front of you. The impact is absolutely massive.
Big +1 to Chris's answer. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's going to affect, the evolution of SSI is going to affect the whole of the call it the token space, because it does just expand and give a lot more depth to what a token can be and how it can operate. And I'll just stop there, because that's another whole webinar behind that one.
To double down on that, I agree. We're building technology into our platform that allows us to create a digital identity for a process, a digital identity for a location, and timestamps, things that are important in the cybersecurity landscape. So I think just about anything that could have an identity is fair game for SSI. I agree with you, Chris. I think that's really where we're headed.
Wonderful. We have three more questions now. Fabio is asking, are you aware of any effort to quantify the PI-related risk reduction and associated cost reduction when adopting SSI rather than centralized approaches? Thinking of examples with financial institutions and generally heavily regulated institutions needing to retain much less PI.
Well, I know this, Drummond, I'll speak briefly. I know that how valuable that information would be, but it's a little chicken and egg. We have to have deployments before we can gather that information, before we can have quantifiable numbers. I know that C Ledger, that we've mentioned several times, that's a consortium implementing SSI within the credit union industry, has done preliminary studies and estimates, and I'd invite you to contact them, culedger.org. John Ainsworth is the CEO, and Julie Esser and Daryl O'Donnell, who have been on earlier webinars, and they are, as they get those statistics, they're publishing them to share that. But I don't know of any of enough deployments yet that we have stats that would be hugely valuable in that area.
Yeah, I'll add to that by saying that when we evaluate the an opportunity like self-sovereign identity, we look at, of course, what the current market space for that is like, and you can take a space like identity governance in a business like T-Mobile and extrapolate that out, and this is something I've spoken on publicly, so these are numbers I can share, but we as a business spend tens of millions of dollars on IT audit and governance, and that wraps around a number of different spaces and a number of different cost centers. But what I can say, and that's an annual expenditure, and so when we look at how this could impact our business, we look at the spaces, without having implementations in place. When we evaluate, potential ROI, we say, how big is the space that this impacts? What percentage impact can we expect on this space? And that's a pretty common, process, I think, across businesses when they evaluate new solutions. And so, certainly any one business can measure in large numbers the potential impact of improved governance, reduced security costs around holding PI, and the on the less tangible side, what is the impact on trust, and how does your business grow as a result of increased trust by bringing that, right? I mentioned earlier two numbers, that 88% of consumers make decisions on who they do business with based on trust, and 87% would leave somebody that they're doing business with if they don't like the way that they're handling trusted data. So those are huge impacts. If you start calculating customer acquisition costs and a potential 87% loss or turnover rate based on that, huge opportunity around improving on that.
So if you think about SSI and kind of the fundamentals, it's digital credentials. And if we think about PI and in this space of financial services where that information becomes super sensitive, and we want to apply some level of security or cryptography to that data, SSI is a perfect kind of complement to the desire to create a level of encryption and security of PI and other kind of data assets. So in my mind, I can see architecturally where SSI now becomes the key material for data cryptography in the sense of PI, where the individual's data can be encrypted with their key material, and in a layered cryptography, which exists as well, the data owner, in this case the bank or the financial services, can still have access to that data and still work with it, but the data subject, using SSI and the cryptography keys of SSI as key material, you can achieve a level of data security that we've not been able to achieve before. It's just one architectural example of how SSI solves some of these really big problems of protecting PI.
Awesome. Question from Timothy. We have 3 questions again in the pipeline. User experience is often a huge limiter to technology adoption. Does SSI present a way to greatly enhance the user experience by eliminating passwords and simplifying security?
Yes.
Yes.
You know, absolutely.
I'll put an asterisk in that and say, though, that user experience will impact SSI as much as SSI impacts user experience, right? At the end of the day, consumers care about their information being private and protected, but they also care about wonderful experiences. And so that's why it's really important to not just think about how do we build this technology and how do we protect consumer data, but how do we make it a wonderful experience to interact with this new emerging technology? Because at the end of the day, while me and Drummond and Vaughan and all the other kind of technologists and geeky type folks out there really care about how this technology works and what it is, most people in the world, I like to kind of say with half a tongue in cheek, they don't care about it. What they want is a wonderful experience that protects their information. So I think it's a two-way street here.
Let me give a real world example of how SSI can fundamentally change the user experience. So we all have user ID and passwords for the various social media things that we work with and all kinds of other stuff. Imagine the mobile phone in your pocket having your identity through SSI. No longer would you have to provide credentials when you log into social media or your online e-commerce. Your device will know that it's you because it's perhaps within your geolocation, it's in your home. So a couple of factors can be applied to the credentialing, but it all of a sudden becomes transparent to these services. You no longer have to provide credentialing. You no longer have to worry about saving passwords in platforms that are doing that for you. All that can be replaced with SSI linked to these systems, and that's a reality. That's what's coming.
I can't add anything. I love Chris's quote: "User experience will impact SSI as much as SSI impacts user experience." The proof is in the pudding. The latest or newest working group formed at the Sovrin Foundation is the Decentralized Identity UX working group. There are enough folks involved in the Sovrin community. This is led by a fellow named Bart Suches at SIGPA in Switzerland, who said user experience is going to be the key. That we've got enough of the other components, and now we just need to really nail down UX. And I like to point to Kim Cameron, who's now retired as the chief identity architect at Microsoft, but laid a foundation for all of this stuff 15 years ago with his laws of identity. But one of them, the last of the laws, was consistent user experience across contexts. The safety we need here with SSI and interaction with digital systems is very similar to what we needed with cars, right? If every car had a different way of operating that vehicle, the number of accidents would be extraordinarily higher, right? They had to standardize the basic parts of the experience, and we need to do the same thing here with a brand new form of interaction. So big +1 to UX being critically important, and as Chris says, the fact that it's there is going to change how we do things, which will in turn change other things in user experience. So it's going to be a complex equation.
Wonderful. We have a question from Steve. I don't know how it fits to any of the questions that was asked before, but it's very short, but maybe any of you can answer this. He's asking, how does TTI fit into this whole thing?
Yeah, I can make a comment there. I've been engaged with some of the work going on in the TTI. The TTI, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is the Token Taxonomy Initiative, at least as long as I'm following your acronym usage appropriately. Token Taxonomy Initiative is put out by the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance and a group of partners, including IBM, Microsoft, and Digital Asset. And it's an effort to bring a human and device readable taxonomy to tokens across many different implementations. And you know, I think the short of it is that those types of taxonomies will add to kind of the usability and the overall ecosystem of tokens. And certainly amongst those tokens will be those that interface with identity-based systems. So, you know, there is a correlation in that they touch on some of these similar spaces. I don't know that there is a, to the best of my knowledge, a direct kind of relationship between the two. Anybody else have thoughts?
No, I would agree on that one. The question was asked earlier about you know, credentials as tokens, and maybe, you know, as that matures, that might end up someplace in the taxonomy. But that's as far as my knowledge goes in that space.
Beautiful. We are down to 2 questions now. So Rins, he's asking a question for Drummond. I couldn't make it to the IIW webinar, but apparently SSI was a big topic. How indicative is that for where the space is going?
I think it's very indicative. SSI has become the majority of the discussion and focus of Internet Identity Workshop, which is sort of a bellwether of where things are in the whole of the Internet identity space. People have even started suggesting, let's just rename it to, you know, SSI Workshop. But I think it will stay Internet Identity Workshop because it's open to, you know, the whole evolutionary step. I think it's a major indication, and the growing attendance at IW because of the, you know, increasing understanding relevance. It really, from my perspective, you know, we have broken through, you know, a barrier and entered a new paradigm, as I've covered in my slides. And the activity at conferences like SSI, I mean, IW, I think is a good example. Rebooting Web of Trust is entirely focused on this space. It's also happening twice a year, and it's also growing in, you know, it's a different format, but I'd say the fact we now have 2 conferences around the world that are just devoted to pretty much this space is good indicator.
Wonderful. Last question here from Zoltan. He's asking, how would issuers be incentivized to use SSI if they technically cannot charge verifiers for verification of proofs? If their sole income is from issuing credentials, then why would they support this much less lucrative model, from their perspective, at least? Is SSI mostly aiming at issuers who are not profit-oriented?
So this is Drummond, I just got to jump in on that. It may not be apparent right now how issuers would be able to charge for credentials, but I can speak to that both wearing my Evernym hat and my Sovrin Foundation hat. There's huge interest in that. There are very large issuers that basically become convinced, all right, I got to get into this credential game, but my business is charging for credentials, whether it's credit reporting or it's background check credentials or it's various kinds of business certifications, professional certifications. There are entire industries that are based on that now. We have to have ways for issuers to be able to charge not just the holders, but the verifiers of credentials, and those are in development. And they will, at least I can speak from Hyperledger and a Sovrin perspective, they will be privacy respecting. They will keep the point that it will not require an issuer a verifier to talk directly with an issuer. So there it is. It's going to be happening. It's not there yet, but we have to have the incentives for issuers of all kinds, whether they're not charging for credentials or whether they want to charge the holder for credentials or they want to charge the verifier credentials. All those must be supported, and they will be.
Okay, any further comments from Vaughan and Chris, or is this good?
Nope,
No
that's
more comments from me.
fantastic.
That's good.
Drummond's the man to talk to there.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, wonderful. Yeah, Chris, Vaughan, Drummond, thank you so much for making time and for answering all these questions. It's always wonderful to have a lot of interaction. Any final thoughts that you would like to share with the audience before we leave?
No, it's been a lot of fun. Thank you everybody for coming and joining and asking some great questions and hearing about our work. I think we're all open to driving this conversation further if you have interest, so don't hesitate to reach out.
Thanks all, appreciate it. You should probably go out to the Hyperledger project and get familiar with some of those initiatives to learn more. There's a lot of really good work being done there.
Absolutely,
Wonderful.
it's always a pleasure. I hope, Alex, we didn't break the time limit barrier on this one, but I did expect a lot of questions from a webinar about SSI as a $1 trillion opportunity, and it really is. So I expect we'll have a lot more webinars on this growing out of this over the next year.
Yeah, no, absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for everyone who attended today. Thank you so much, Vaughan, Chris, and Drummond. We will have a number of SSI meetups coming up now in September. One of them will be with Alan from Kiva. There will be another one about the history of SSI. We will have another one with Freebox, which did recently split up from Newport, and they will share with us what they're planning to do in the SSI space from Freebox. And many more of those coming up. So I'll be sharing them as they come up. Please sign up at the newsletter or join our Telegram group or Twitter or Facebook, whatever tool you use, or LinkedIn, and we share those notifications with everyone there. And I'm just checking if there's any more questions. Just let me read the question very quickly. Okay, there's just one person saying that they're working very closely with telecom innovation laboratories, and that they will forward some emails to me, and I might connect them with you if that's needed. So thank you so much. Check out all those channels for the upcoming SSI meetups in September, and it was great having you with us and trying a new format, and I think worked really well. So thank you again.